Thank you all for being here and for being interested in this topic. From someone coming from the global south, I'm from Brazil, but I have been in the UK for 1 year doing a research on regenerative practices applied to museums. So I'll be glad to tell you about this. What we're going to do today is have a little bit of current context for what's happening in climate collapse. I'm not going to go into too much climate science, and you are all aware of this, but just to understand why we're doing this. Then we go into the findings of my research in the Regenerative Museums research, and hopefully this will bring reflections and implications for this museum and questions at the end. So I'm going to do 40 to 45 minutes and allow you 15 minutes for questions and answers, if that's okay for you. And why I'm here, and I really thank you for the invitation of this museum to be here. I have met Paul Smith 12 years ago in Brazil, in a correlation between this museum and Brazilian museums. I have done some studies before in arts and culture, but also in communications, but I have moved to sustainability in the last 8 years. And I have been studying sustainability throughout the knowledge of the Eco-Village movement, but also throughout an organization called Gaia Education that is a partner of UNESCO to train trainers for sustainable development. And one thing that was really frustrating to me was to see that museums colleagues were never there. And I want to bring that knowledge into the museums field. So I studied climate leadership and regenerative design as part of this path. And I do believe that deep ecology and going through social ecology lenses is important as a level of integrity of museums professionals who work with sustainable practices. So this is how I learned sustainability, by doing hands-on programs. And my work combines social and environmental causes with arts and culture in museums. So I have 25 years of working not only in the field of museums, because I also worked for human rights organizations before. And today what I do, it's a combination of museums, arts and culture, but also sustainable practices. I'm not sure if you are familiar with the ICON Sustain Committee. It has been recently created, and this executive committee is responsible for sustainable practices development. You are all invited to be members. If you are a member of ICON, you can assign to be affiliated. So I'm a vice chair, and I'm happy to talk about this at the end of the lecture if you are interested as well. I also work in different consultancies, international, Julius Bicycle. I work for Key Culture, which is devoted for sustainable practice in arts and culture. So this is a little bit of me, and you can see Paul in the middle of this trip to Brazil. I worked for the British Council for 6 years, and I was responsible to do this program, which was about the social impact of museums and the correlations between the UK and Brazil. And I also was the deputy director for the Museum of Modern Art in Brazil, my recent job before I jumped into sustainable practices. As an entrepreneur, I have done different things and very interested in social innovation in museums. You can search, you can have a look how I understand that environmentalists can help museums to go into more an advocacy way of working. And this is my work with ICON, which is a volunteer work. For 6 years, I have been in different boards, and I'm helping, working with China, with South Korea, with other places, with Brazil, with Prague, having workshops for museums professionals to enter into social innovation and environmental impact. So this is RegeneraMuseu. It's an organization that I created in Brazil 7 years ago. It's devoted to works with sustainability, but actually through the lenses of regeneration, which I'm going to explain to you. If you are familiar with regeneration, even better, but I think I'm going to bring this notion today. So what we do is consultancy, facilitation, capacity building, and projects and initiatives in a network of associated consultants. And this is a little flavor of how I work in Brazil, because I work with museums, giving them a sense of an ecological purpose, even though if we're doing strategic planning for museums. So we go outside, we do mindfulness, we do body language approach so people can embody the whole knowledge. This is my work with the Science Museum of the State of São Paulo. And we have a channel on Instagram. It's mainly devoted for the new generations of museums professionals to learn about what decolonial practices means, what ecological thinking means, what regenerative practice means, in peels of 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes video. And I am a teacher of museums management for 10 years, and I'm really interested in a new generation of museums professionals to be engaged into this. And if you are interested, you can follow RegeneraMuseu on Instagram as well. Okay, so we came today to talk about regenerative museums, and I just want to do this warning. I don't have the right answer for this. I have one perspective, which is based on my own background. And the other perspectives that I collected in the evidence of my research come from 12 interviewees who were interested in telling more about how regenerative practices apply to museums. And I'm bringing to you today lots of questions, perhaps for you to think about how this can bring insights for the future of this museum. That's my proposal for today. I don't have, as I said, the right answer. I'm not a scientist, but I have some perspectives to bring. So, the heavy stuff, the climate collapse. I have one page, just for us to remember, we are on the severe sequence of climate events, global warming, biodiversity loss, intensified pollution, the sea level rising, and the scientists that are talking about the sixth mass extinction, which is progressively happening until starting from 2100. It's a real thing. It's happening. And I just got this news from this year of the global temperature that is rising, that it's exceeding the limit that was set in the Paris Agreement. For us to remember that it's accelerating too fast. That's the main point. Because climate change has been here for a while. But the fact that it's accelerating too fast, it brings us to an emergency call. And I highlight the climate injustice because, of course, museums and heritage sector are working a lot in terms of preparedness for severe events. But are we talking enough about climate injustice? And I brought this map, which is really clear that the most poor economies and the most vulnerable people are suffering so much more the climate change effects than the other countries that are richer countries. So how do we then look into ancestral knowledge and heritage knowledge that can be linked to why it's such a thing? Why colonialism has brought us to the situation where climate change does affect so much more the poorest countries. So I have these two slides about climate change and the climate impact, so just to set us the scene for what we need to talk. I have looked at Oxford. I have looked at the impact of Oxfordshire in terms of what's going to happen to this territory. One thing in regeneration that is very important is very much place-based. Everything is about the place. It's about this city. It's about this neighborhood. So extreme events, dry summers, warmer and wetter winters, and the floods and the winter temperatures are increasing. This has pressure over the local health system, and also it's going to put in risk more vulnerable people and the elderly, of course. And there are food implications, and there are food restrictions out of that. So sometimes people ask me, but how climate change affects Oxford, affects these places? Because I'm from Brazil, the climate change is affecting us every day. But it does affect you, it does affect this territory. And one thing that I want to ask you is how much you are considering the eco-anxiety of your audiences. Are you monitoring that? How people are feeling about it? How we can hold space for conversations, because we don't have the solutions, but museums may have spaces for welcoming questions. And eco-anxiety, it's about that. It's how museums can nurture conversations for people to talk about this. So what is the impact for the natural history museums? What are the stories that contribute to creating awareness and action so society can respond to crises? I'm not necessarily think that museums will convey the change, but maybe they can help society to choose and select what type of actions they can do. What stories we're doing that contribute to destruction, extractivism, and exploitation? Sometimes not quite clear how a tag or how a narrative, it's still contributing to a counterproductive narrative for people to continue being extractive. And how clear we are about that. It's about language, it's about nomenclature, it's about who we are involving. And another question, what new stories can contribute to a positive future of the natural history? And I'm sure you all have been thinking about this, but I'm just questioning because this is where the regenerative thinking may be helpful. So, how much natural is our Natural History Museum? And I want to bring this question because I am involved in many discussions about multiple cosmovisions about what nature is. And here we may have scientists specialized on natural science, but there is other ways of seeing it. There is the First Nations way of seeing it, the indigenous ways of seeing it. There is other ways of seeing what nature is. And I just brought James Lovelock because I think it's very important for us at this time that we're living in to remember that Earth is alive. And the theory of Gaia is basically saying that the planet is an animated space and we are co-participatories of this animated space. How much of this narrative is present on the museum at the moment? Does it matter if we bring this approach? And how much commitment is here? It's there for the future of natural history. Because I'm not just asking for this museum, for all natural history museums, if we are talking about the natural history from the past, but we are caring about the next 100 years, what stories we're going to be telling. So I brought this, probably you have seen different charts similar to this, just to remember us, the climate crisis is out there, and some exhibitions in museums are just talking about this little piece above the water. But we have a bigger foundation of why we have climate change, why we have climate collapse. And the reason why we have it, it's a mixture of factors, but the foundation is in the nature extractivism that comes from Industrial Revolution, the power over, the whole colonialism thing, the land misplacement. And there's so much about land misplacement that collections can tell about. A lot of these stories can be told by the collection's interpretation, but we are not seeing this yet happening. So the stories of separation between humans and nature, when did that start? When did that happen? Are people aware of that? Can they have an object story? And throughout this object, they understand that this was imposed to us. It's not necessarily how we see the world, but it was imposed. So whiteness, white fragility, patriarchy, the repression of the female connection with nature, where the medicine, the natural medicine was so natural and it's not anymore, it's missed. And the social injustice and the human exploitation is the same coin as the nature exploitation. So how much of this foundation is present on your narrative? How much you think this should be or could be part of your narratives? I brought this image because I think it's beautiful just to see this difference between when this story of separation between humans and nature started. So the modern concept of the progress and development has been shaped since medieval times and Industrial Revolution, but we need to understand where it started. Can we help to reverse the story of separation? Would that be helpful? How we would start if we look at this perspective historically and look at the science? How was the science before and how is the science now? So this is just a chart that is done by the Regenerators Academy. It's one organization that trains regenerative leadership about the importance of the wholeness, the importance of exercising the power with instead of the power over. For us to remember, if we bring nature and humans all together back again, what could you do? What type of leadership would emerge? So here is just to remind us the whole notion of the domination of nature. How different is this if we feel that we are nature? Would we describe animals and the nomenclature about the biology in a different way? Would we see us as an equal instead of ego and the comparison of that? How does that happen? So I just brought the Museum of Natural History and just a reflection that, of course, the museum is thinking about all those things. The museum is reflecting about the future visions of nature. How is the perception of natural environment of this? And also working with artists. And I got this quote that I think is very interesting from Paul Smith about the threats of global diversity and the fact that the museum needs to monitor this very closely. And Oxford is taking care of the Net Zero campaign. And the museum has reacted, and the museum has created its environmental responsibility policy. So I look at your policy, of your environmental policy of this museum. And there's a lot about sustainable travel, energy use, resource purchasing, food, which is a lot about the net zero narrative, and it's needed. It's great that the museum is doing this. It's part of the equation. But I'm much more interested in public engagement. I'm very much interested in how this museum can move society to go beyond the net zero narrative and really start doing things for the biodiverse laws and for understanding their human impact on this. So what is our goal for sustainability as museums? Are we trying to sustain buildings, objects, or are we trying to sustain life? And what life means for us, what it means for the visitors, what it means for the non-human world, for the animals, for the trees. I like at the beginning of the temporary exhibitions, they're very provocative in the museum, and they're very much aligned with these narratives, and I see there's another one coming in. And the whole idea of mapping threats to diversity. But what about the main primary narratives, the core programs, the main exhibitions, the education programs? What else can be done in terms of navigating throughout this full awareness of climate change and what can be done? The Hope for the Future is a great project as well. And the Museum of Climate Hub, the digital trail, all of this is really in this direction. So when I see the life collections and the notion of life, that's the question I'm bringing in. Can we rethink and think about what life means for this museum? Are we ready to have this discussion of the boundaries of future life and how this museum can be committed to all forms of life and why this is important? So sustainability may not be enough anymore. And this is a very hard conversation to have in 5 minutes, but there's a whole point, and there are authors and thinkers and studies and scientists studying why we need to learn to regenerate, because we reach to a point that is not enough anymore to be sustainable. So how much of this equation is about the natural world and how much is about the history? So I brought this quick chart here just to have a reflection of how much of your natural world is about the past nature, the present nature, and the future nature. What is the balance that we need in the museum between these 3 strands, and how we need to look into how present nature will be shaped for the future that we deserve. And in terms of past history, how the official history has framed how these past nature stories are told. Are we ready to hear all the stories and then maybe rethink about our future history? So the future nature depends on the regeneration of the present nature. That's a given for us at the moment. And in the history side, other perspectives on history may tell us the ways of knowing and shaping our future history because they know the patterns of the land, which maybe we in urban areas or because of our backgrounds, we don't know. So this is just a way of us to provoke and think, could this museum learn how to regenerate the present nature? Would that be interesting? How would that be done about us thinking about the future nature and the stories we want to tell? So I'm going to go now into the findings of my research. I brought you many questions, reflections that may be relevant to you, may not be relevant to you, but the research project I'm going to present now may have ideas of how to approach these questions. So let's see if we have ideas about this. But I want to talk to you first what regeneration means. A lot of people in the UK understand regeneration as urban regeneration. So regeneration is an ancestral practice, but we need to be reminded in modernity, what does it mean? But regeneration at first, it's our cells, it's our body. Lots of people here from biology, you know this very easily. All living systems have the capacity to regenerate. But we brought the system to such an exhaustion and extent of destruction that the natural systems are not being able to regenerate itself anymore. So we need to intervene in the system to bring life back into a point that we can be sustainable again. Because at the moment, the system cannot be able to regenerate by itself if we don't understand what has been degenerated in the system. So I like this chart from the Royal Society of Arts in the UK because I think it's easier to understand that we leave the extractive mode from Industrial Revolution. We are now living this whole notion of sustaining, which is reducing the damage and sustaining the system. But why we need to move into regenerate? Because nature needs to be restored, our value system needs to be restored, and we don't have time enough just to be sustainable. This chart is from Real Read. It's a framework that has been created in the US by a thinker of the Regenerative group. It has been extensively used for regenerative researchers. It demonstrates how, when you are in a destructive system, how we have done conventional practices that turns out that the system became exhausted. And then I'm going to show you this one, which is much easier. Because people ask me frequently, what's the difference between regenerative development and sustainable development? And sustainable development mixes the social and environmental issues, which is great to bring a new balance to the system. But it's not enough, as we need to relinquish and restore and do reparations as well throughout the process. So I think this one is also good to see. From extracting, we move to less damage, then we start doing good. So the sustainability model is much more on doing less damage. Stop the carbon footprint. Okay, great. Do good is sustainable development, which is social and environmental, can do good things for the territory. But because of the acceleration and the exhaustion of the system, we need to move on and also consider regenerating the places and going back to the whole idea of regenerating life. So I hope you are with me now in the concept of regeneration. If you are interested in going deeper, regeneration comes from much earlier on permaculture, concepts, social ecology, but it has been in the last 30 to 40 years that regeneration has been studied for modernity and applied to any field, including architecture, urban development, including other areas of fashion and other industries as well. My interest is to bring this to the museum sector. There are books you can have a look. These books have been the source of the literature of this research. So, in principle, you ask, okay, but what are the principles? There are 7 principles. They are described in different ways by different authors. But you guys probably are expert in looking at the living system. How the living system keep it alive, keep it vibrant and thriving. There are some processes that have been studied throughout many years because we understand that we are going to death in terms of the planet survival now. So we need to relearn how to bring life back. And I'm going to explain the 7 principles when we go through examples from museums, but it's basically looking on how living systems apply to any field of work. If we're doing strategic planning, how do we scan your strategic plan and say, okay, this can generate life? Okay, those are some frameworks, and I'm not going to go through a detail, but basically this frameworks helps you as a manager of using tools to bring nature to the table in terms of having nature as a stakeholder, design as nature, understand future thinking that includes reconciliation, includes relinquishing the process. So let's say you have your team in education or curatorship, and you can use these frameworks to plot some ideas where your program sits into, where your programs are in terms of nested system, in terms of wholeness, in terms of generating life. So the research objectives were around identifying how regenerative thinking and principles actually can enhance the sustainable practices in museums. What are the regenerative leadership qualities in museums? Unique contributions museums can do to regeneration and regenerative practices that already exist in museums. There are museums doing this already, and we can be inspired. It was 5 months research. The research methods include interviews, desk research, illustrative examples, and probably you know some of these people here. A lot of them from the UK, but also from the Global South, the director of the Green Museum UK, the director of the Manchester University Museum, and many other people who are regenerative thinkers. The videos will be available on a YouTube channel very soon as they allow us to do so. So you can hear 1 hour interview with each of them. Okay, so I'm gonna resume and summarize to you the main findings. And maybe you can think about how relevant this is to you. We are in the museums now in response to climate change. A lot of the frameworks have been not necessarily a positive framework. So the degrowth, for example, the decolonization, they bring sometimes negative connotations for people. When you say museums need to have fewer visitors or less collections, and it's frightening for the museum sector. But regenerative is proactive, it's positive, but it does include decolonial thinking. It does include degrowth. But we are looking to a positive framework of regenerating this territory and having an effort for this to happen. So the idea that emerged from the research is, can regenerative thinking be a next or an important or a paradigm for museums to follow? Another thing that came in out of the research was the whole idea that regeneration can reframe sustainable development. We need to understand that sustainable development, it's good, it's important, but it's not enough. And I think we need to understand why it's not enough. One reason it's not enough, it's because it's based on economic growth. It's based on quantitative growth as opposed to qualitative growth. Regenerative development is based on qualitative growth. And it's based on well-being. So the whole thing that's also we discuss about, there is a separation between social and environmental areas in museums. So if you look at the sustainability usually sits into the operations, which is a lot about environmental thing. But diversity and inclusion sits in another area in the museum. But when you think about regenerative practice and sustainable practices, they should be merged. They should look at each other as one unique framework for change. So regenerative thinking, it's about combining those issues and reflecting about what a qualitative growth means for this museum. I have done a framework for helping museums to analyze if they are in the extractive mode, sustainable mode, or perhaps regenerative mode. And this is not a final framework because you may be in the regenerative museums framework on one narrative, on one temporary exhibition. But you may be on the operational level in extractive museum because you have not done yet your carbon footprint reduction. So I'm gonna make this available because it's a big list. In the report, you can see it, but it may give you reflection if you are reacting to the frameworks, the regulations, or if you're actually thinking about how we can regenerate this territory and make a big change. So this is Bill Reed, one of the founders and the authors and beginning of this idea of regeneration applied to modernity. And he said it's beautiful to see the possibility of museums acting this way. And I'm going to explain you a little bit more about the notion of the 7 principles. So those are the 7 principles of regenerative thinking. And what we have learned, I'm not going to do the opposite side. How these principles apply to museums. So the notion of whole is the whole idea that we can bridge social and environmental sustainability, but also we can mind nature and human's interconnectedness. It's basically understand a systemic way of operating. There is no separation between nature and humans. How would that change the way we work in museums? The second principle is potential of the places. Every place has a potential. Usually we use the framework of problem solving. Regenerative development, regenerative design use the framework of potential. What can thrive in Oxfordshire? What can be fruitful on these specific topics of this exhibition? And then you can frame this as a geographic location or a symbolic location as well. The third one is essence. What is the essence of this museum that meets the potential of this place? The collection, the stories, whatever. The fourth one is developmental. Everything in nature, at the end of the process of the cycle, leaves everyone that has been involved in a new capacity way. They have built their capacities. Can we create a social-ecological capacity and literacy through a process of doing projects in the museum. The nodal intervention, it means that nature knows how to effect change by doing one intervention that it will create a scale and impact. When you mind the project in the museum, can you do that in a way that you can think about scale and impact for more life, for this museum to be more alive or to be sustaining more life? And the nestedness, which is basically understanding that we have the visitor, the museum, the town, the country, and then the planet. What can we do and what we do that has this nested impact? And how do we see the possibility of creating a generation of regenerators? If through the process we help them to understand how you're guiding them. And the final one is reciprocity, which is a lot about mutual learning with communities, participatory process that we can all learn from each other. So the research demonstrates that this framework can help us to reverse the nature-human separation in the way we work in museums. May repurpose our work in museums and align our management systems to a more living systems approach and revitalize the sector to a different way of operating. And this is, as I said, is out of these 12 interviews, quotes, and how they reflect on that. Another finding is the fact that decolonization has been very important in the museums to talk about the social issues, the community engagement, the other worldviews, but we have not done a job yet about bringing an ecological lens to decolonization. I'm not generalizing, some of the problems are, but we probably could deal more with reparation of ecocide, epistemic and historicide if we look into the ecological effects of colonization. So unlocks the wisdom in restoring ecosystems, because if we do this in mutual agreement with the community that is receiving repatriation objects, for example, they can help the museum to understand the patterns of the lands where these objects came from, and to understand why this is important for the present moment. It empowers new generations, enhances understands of ecological patterns, and restores this balance between historical narrative and the local community curatorial practices. I'm going to give you an example. You probably are familiar, know about the repatriation of 174 objects from the Manchester University Museum to Ireland in Australia. So they decided to have a permanent living cultures position, a curatorship in the museum. They started dialogue for a long term. It's not only about sending an object, and I know the Pitt Rivers has done similar works as well, but this is a clear example of the wholeness. They understand that these objects is in a much more context that can help the museum to relearn their patterns about their collections interpretation. And they have done this. They have changed patterns of the collections management based on what they learned through the process. So this is Esme Ward, and then she mentioned to us that in return, the group of people from this island, they decided to give to the museum shell dolls. And they said, we would like to create a new pattern for the conservation of the shell dolls. I would like you to play with these dolls. It's going to be at least once a year. And then she was talking about the shift of the way we work with collections, understanding that this is a live culture object. It's not just an inanimated object. How does that shift the way we think about these collections? So this is really about the whole process. I'm not going to give you the whole examples, but you can look at the report, the repatriation of the Tonga ancestors from the Australian Museum, who also have been interviewed for this research. They use the process of nodal intervention. So by having these ancestor remains sending back to this region, lots of things has changed in the museum, and they have been reflecting on their First Nation commissions for reparation. They have a 3-year plan, reparation project plan. And how does this object also, no, it's not object, it's a human remain, when it was sent back, had an effect on lots of other things the museum is doing. And other examples as well. And this other find, I think two more of the research, is the fact that museums can be healers of places. And sometimes people say the healers is not an appropriate language, but maybe regenerate these places and create biocultural wisdom from the communities to relearn what needs to be regenerated in Oxford or in the places where these collections of the Oxford Natural History Museum came from. How impact would that have? So I made a chart in this report that demonstrates that some museums were born regeneratively because they have been taking care of places regeneration since they were born. And usually they are the eco-museums. If you are familiar with the concept of eco-museums, the territorial museums, community museums, the social museology, I can explain this whole thing, the indigenous museums, they are all regenerative. I don't need to teach them anything. They were born like that. They have elements and frameworks that demonstrate they have been regenerating life for quite a while. But we here as urban museum, national museums, public, private, very established, can we learn to be regenerative? And maybe these eco-museums are an inspiring source for us. So this is an eco-museum of the Amazon. She's also the director, has been interviewed in this research, and she talks about how the trees and the rivers and the animals, they are the collections, they are the living collections. It's a different setting, it's a different thing, but here you also have the park, you have the garden, you also have these living entities surrounding the museum. How do we connect to them, dialogue to them? So the eco-museums, they are community run, they are focused on the local development, they have this whole notion that the cultural heritage will lift us to a new regenerative position. But it's embodying them, it's naturally developed. So it's nice to be close and to understand their principles. But I know this museum is not an eco-museum. But maybe one of your education program can be similar to what an eco-museum does. It's just one strain, it's just one education program that you develop that have similar qualities and you can learn from. So the final finding, it's a block because we asked the interviews, what is the unique role museums can play in planetary regeneration? And they said these 4 things, which I'm going to go through. Shifting the narratives. Can we understand how much modern technical industrial society stories we're telling repeatedly? And can we understand how we, by bringing this other way of thinking, we can shift our narratives? This is another interviewee from Brazil, and they have different programs, but one of the programs they have is called Toxitour. It's showing the degenerative truth, showing you what is degenerated, showing the impact of things. And it's a difficult tour, but it has been developed for 2 years by an university in Brazil to have people from urban areas to go to most vulnerable areas and see the pollution from industrial areas and have a conversation and understand what's happening and working with schools. So this is the Australian Museum. They also have been looking to exposing the degenerative truth. This is Nick Merriman, who wrote a book this year of the climate change impacting museums, but also he is the National Heritage Director now. And we had lots of conversations with his interviews also in the report about the importance of us telling the truth and learning how to do it. This is the Tanzania Museum in Kenya, is devoted to talk about the future history, the future natural history museum, they call themselves like that, for the children of Africa. So they have committees with children, they ask them about the future, they ask about ancestral knowledge, and they are creating a restoration of a quarry. So the communities are participating and they are learning how to become an eco-museum park that talks about the future natural history in the place in Kenya. So how we can then shift our narratives for new possible futures. I'm sure maybe you're familiar with the Australian Museum. They create a climate hub, and through the climate hub, they are creating exhibitions together with the First Nations and talking about misplacement and how the pattern of lands in Australia can be relearned throughout a coalition with these First Nations. So uphold communities. As I said in the beginning, climate change affects people in a different way. And having conversations, coffee talks, I'm not sure, maybe you're doing this already, but having the people that are visiting the museum to expose their anxieties and having conversations in a way that it's not about hard data. It's about the feelings, and I think this is also really important, especially for the future. And the whole idea of understanding that conservation and preservation at the moment has a different role to play than it had in the past. So some of the interviewees, they reflect on that very closely and saying that if we have problems of maintaining all these collections and we have an issue now of climate severe events that are going to hit our collections, how then we think about adapting and creating other ways of impacting the society rather than just conserving and preserving. So the whole notion of creating a generation of regenerators is an invitation for museums to look at their visitors of a possibility of this new generation to learn about maybe things that we didn't learn, that we were not told about, how we shift our paradigm from extractive to regenerative. Can we learn how to do this? Is that important for us? So there are positive stories being told. If you want to look at the example of the Phipps Conservatory in the United States, they use the regenerative framework with the strategic plan. You can see the plan, the 4 years plan of the museum has regenerative frameworks. And the director talks about that, how conservancy can meet regeneration, how does that happen? The rewilding projects, as you see the recent exhibition at the Manchester Museum about the wild, they have been having a lot of talks about what wild means for people in Manchester, about rewilding projects. I just want to show you this chart, which is regenerative thinking is a lot about place. What they say, the regenerative thinkers, is that we cannot regenerate the planet. We're not going to do this. But we can regenerate places, neighborhoods, cities, towns, areas, villages. So in the museum context, the place can be the place where you are. So this neighborhood, or Oxfordshire. Or it can be the regions from where the objects of the collections were taken from. Because place in museums can be expanded when you start thinking about how you can regenerate places. And the bigger one, it's a territory of knowledge. It's about the things that are behind the objects and collections that are in people's minds and hearts that you can regenerate. So if the perspective of someone in relation to gender, in relation to agriculture, it's counterproductive to regeneration, how do we then shift that in a way that people can reflect in a different way? So you probably are familiar with the Manchester Museum Climate Hub. It has been a very good case of thinking and doing and experimenting things together, not knowing, but learning together. The Anzania Museum, if you are interested in seeing their quarry restoration, the Eco Museum Amazon, they do lots of activities with vegetable gardens, with children learning about biodiversity. This is the Museum of Tomorrow in the Brazilian Bay. It has 10 years now. They started with a vegetable garden in an urban area, and now they're moving to agroforest in an area that didn't have any tree. They're building this in the area surrounding the museum, and you can learn more about it. So finally, it's not easy to do regeneration museums if we're not looking to the people like you who could be interested in entering a regenerative leadership. But regenerative leadership, it's a lot about uncertainty. It's a lot about accepting this collapse. It's about experimenting. It's about unlearning. It's non-cognitive learning when you go into deep ecology, and also peer learning about sharing ecological identities and saying, yeah, maybe we should go into this and learn. And I'll see if I can show this movie at the end. Before that, I just want to show something, and then we do the movie. I think it's easier. Oops. Which is this thinking about surrounding or not knowing or learning together about this future that is very uncertain. So I'm going to have 4 blocks of questions to you about how we will do this. If the Oxford Natural History Museum is interested in learning more about regeneration and maybe we could explore this idea for a while. Could you regenerate territories? What scale and size would be? What interesting possibility we could look at? If we're looking to regenerate our purpose, looking at life as future history museum, future natural history, what would that be? And what change would that make? And if we look at what can we do? Okay, rewilding projects, vegetable gardens, but it's not our role, it's the botanical gardens role, or creating climate hubs here, creating a community climate action, or grant an award for regenerative thinkers to be here in immersive programs and then learn with them, or creating a biodiversity preservation project in town, or a regenerative reinterpretation of the collections, working with consultancies or working with the communities. Whatever you do, what I want you to reflect is why you would do this, for what reason, for what purpose. And it is a provocation for us to think about why it's so important to do it now, and why it shakes a little bit our beliefs in terms of what a natural history museum should be doing. But it is an urgent call. And the urgent call is because the new generations are really looking for us in terms of having responses for this. And the future of natural history also depends on our actions today for the sake of the new generations, but also for the histories we want to tell. So I'm going to show this last video here. Let me see if I can do it from here. Maybe you have seen it from the United Nations in 2021. Should work.
You okay? You need a minute? Cool. Okay. Listen up, people. I know a thing or two about extinction. And let me tell you, and you'd kind of think this would be obvious, going extinct is a bad thing. And driving yourselves extinct? In 70 million years, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. At least we had an asteroid. What's your excuse? You're headed for a climate disaster, and yet every year governments spend hundreds of billions of public funds on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we had spent hundreds of billions per year subsidizing giant meteors. That's what you're doing right now. Think of all the other things you could do with that money. Around the world, people are living in poverty. Don't you think helping them would make more sense than, I don't know, paying for the demise of your entire species? Let me be real for a second. You've got a huge opportunity right now. As you rebuild your economies and bounce back from this pandemic, this is humanity's big chance. So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late. It's time for you humans to stop making excuses and start making changes. Thank you.
So I'm not sure if you have seen this before. How many of you have seen this before? This was done by the United Nations in 2021, prior to the copy. And I think it's interesting to see that there's humor involved. You have here the dinosaurs, extinction narrative. Not everything needs to be so serious and so sad. And there are ways of telling this. We need to find out how for the new generations. And I think seeing an official video like that was very interesting. And final one. This one was just calling for a change, and this one is about regenerative leadership. Let me see, where is it?
We can run the risk of doing what we have done with the field of sustainability to regeneration. And the process of becoming a regenerator is a lot different to what we have ever done before. It's about surrendering to not knowing, surrendering to not having all the answers, surrendering to being courageous and curious about the patterns and principles and forms and functions of living systems, the only system that has stood the test of time. So there is something happening at the moment where people are flocking towards those that know about regenerative principles and are almost demanding a recipe. Give me that 10-step formula. Give me that recipe. But that's not really how the field of regeneration works. We need to hold space for emergence in an entirely different way, and we're not trained to do that. So that is where we enter this void almost, this foggy, gooey phase of metamorphosis, where we slowly but surely put one foot in front.
Okay, can you go to the end? So that was about the message that I had to bring you today, and I hope you had some ideas of what regeneration, how regeneration can be applied to museums' work, and some reflections of what applies to you and what doesn't apply to you. And I'm gonna send to Ricardo. The report has been marked now at the University of Leicester, and we're gonna release in an online link together with the video, so you can watch it and if you are interested. But if you want to stay for 5 minutes questions, but I really want to thank you for listening to this, and hopefully you have learned something new for the future of the museum. Thank you.